Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Camille? Okay, great. I can't see everyone, of course, but on behalf of the Institute of Sacred Music, welcome to this webinar with Camille Dungy. I've known Camille for many, many years. Haven't seen her in many, many years, but we can talk about the years back in Lynchburg, Virginia. The way this is going to work tonight is Camille will read us a few poems to begin, and then she and I will have a conversation, unstructured conversation. We'll see where it goes. And then she can take some questions from the people who are listening, or you can put them in the chat as we go along. And I can even insert them into the conversation as we go. But if you have questions, please do put them in the chat as we go along. So Camille Dungy is the author of numerous books. Most recently, The Guidebook to Relative Strangers, this book of personal essays linked together as a memoir, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Book, what's it? National Book Critics Circle Award. Yeah. The subtitle is Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History. She's also the author of Trophic Cascade, and she can explain to you what the title means. I won't do that, but it came out in the same year, and it won the Colorado Book Prize. She's a Guggenheim Fellow in 2019. She's won the American Book Award, many, many other prizes. What I love about Camille's work, the first thing is the sonic quality of it. We had an exchange about this when I was inviting her. I'm teaching a course on Hopkins right now, and she's coming into that class tomorrow to talk to them about sound. So that's the first thing that I would point out in some of the poems she'll read, is just how beautifully they sound. It's not an ornament, though. I mean, it's integral to what she's saying. And that's the second part, exactly what is being said. What I love in this work is the way that she ravels together different strands of experience. And it's not as if they're intersecting, it's as if they're fused the way that they are in life. And you'll see. And so it's not as if she's one moment a mother, one moment a poet, one moment an environmentalist. It's as if all these things are at the same time. And the poems are wonderful distillations of that. So it's a real pleasure to have you, Camille. I can't believe I'm seeing you here after all these years, but thanks for being with us, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really nice to be here. And thanks to all of you who took some time out of your, I guess it's evenings probably, in your part of the world. I'm in Colorado, northern Colorado, so the sun's still out where I am. So I'll read for a little while and read and talk, and then Chris and I'll talk, and we'll carry on from there. And I feel like I should maybe kind of foreground a little bit about why this invitation in particular felt so right for me, which is that one of the other pieces that I weave all the time into my experience is having been raised in a observant Christian family, where the liturgy and the music and the kind of ways of organizing language around faith and biblical and spiritual action were just part of a dailiness. Also, my grandfather was an American Baptist preacher, and my parents raised me as a good Presbyterian. So I had a fair amount of that always in my life. And so actually the first poem I thought I would read to you plays off of one of the first poems I ever remember memorizing. And we could have a conversation about whether or not this counts as a poem or a saying or an aphorism or a what you would call it, but it's a rhyme that helps you remember the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four posts my bed rest on, one to watch and one to pray and two to bear my soul away. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5. I remember memorizing that rhyme. It's very helpful. It remains helpful in daily life. And it would have been my grandmother, who was one of the people who insisted that I memorize poems and that I memorize biblical verses and all of these things. So the title of this poem is One to Watch and One to Pray. We passed the baby over the bed, and later we passed tissue and her Bible with its onion skin pages, its highlighted lessons and dog-eared parables she kept handy with bookmarks whose tassels hung and swayed as her hair might have done when she was very sweet and very young. And when we had finished what reading we would read, we stopped a little while to register the pleasant song the woman on the stereo was singing. And then the baby cried for milk. And so we passed her back across the bed, which is when someone asked if there was any more water. And we passed the water over her lips with the swab the nurses gave us just for this. A square pink bubblegum lollipop looking deal, like the treats she used to give us when we were very sweet and very young. And someone came with roses. And though we smelled the flowers because we hoped for something better than the smell that lingered all around us, hot house flowers look alive long after their lively smells have faded. So when someone came in with cards, we passed the cards and flowers over the bed and stood them up with the other cards and flowers on the little stand of white plastic and chrome that passed for a bedside table in that place. And when a friend came in who hadn't met the baby, we passed the baby over the bed and the friend said, "She's so sweet." And when a cousin came who knew things few of us knew, we listened to stories from when both of them were very young. And when someone cried, we passed the tissue over the bed. And when someone said, "She's so small now," we remembered the pink square bubblegum lollipop swab. And when the nurse said, "You can tell by how she breathes," someone got the Bible from the little chrome and plastic stand. And when someone said, "It's okay to leave," we didn't want to do a thing. And though several days later, someone told me people somewhere in West Africa pass a baby over the bed of a dying person to say there will always be new bodies to celebrate and mourn, that night, we only knew the baby needed a change and someone had to take her. And so we passed the baby over the bed and decided who would stay to watch her go. So that poem is in Trophic Cascade, this collection of poems that Chris referenced. It's my most recently published collection, and that title is a scientific, like ecological science word, which has to do with the kind of cascade of life that happens when you remove or replace a trophy creature at the top of the food chain. So like the top predator at the top of the food chain, its absence or its replacement will change the course of life for everything that comes afterwards. Perhaps the most well-known recent example of this is the story of the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone. And I got really, really into that story, like really into that story, thinking about it and writing through it for quite some time until I figured out what it was about that story that got me interested. Trophic Cascade. After the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone, and as anticipated, their culling of deer, trees grew beyond the deer stunt of the mid-century. In their upreach, songbirds nested, who scattered seed for underbrush, and in that cover warrened snowshoe hare. Weasel and water shrew returned, also vole, and came soon hawk and falcon, bald eagle, kestrel, and with them hawk shadow, falcon shadow. Eagle shade and kestrel shade haunted newly buried runnels where mule deer no longer rummaged, cautious as they were now of being surprised by wolves. Berries brought bear, while undergrowth and willows growing now right down to the river brought beavers who dam. Muskrats came to the dams and tadpoles came to the night song of the fathers of tadpoles. With water striders, the dark gray American dipper bobbed in fresh pools of the river, and fish stayed. And the bear who fished also culled deer fawns, and to their kill scraps came vulture and coyote, long gone in the region until now. And their scattered seed, and more trees, brush, and berries grew up along the river that had run straight and so flooded, but thus dammed, compelled to meander, is less prone to overrun. Don't you tell me this is not the same as my story. All this life, born from one hungry animal, this whole new landscape, the course of the river changed. I know this. I reintroduced myself to myself, this time a mother, after which nothing was ever the same. So I got to thinking about how in my own life, my trophy creature is in many ways my child. Like the introduction of my child into my life changed everything about the whole food chain of my existence, my web of being, and also the disappearance of elders. But also there's this way in which coming into this very human web in this particular way also brought me into a natural web, like a kind of web of animal existence differently also. And so that provided me this entryway. And I think it seems like what my writing may have always been doing, but what I've become much more aware of in the construction of my writing now is the circularity, the way that there's elders and then there's new people who are coming, and that there's loss and there's joy. Maybe that also goes back to spending summers all the time with my grandparents. And so when you spend summers with a minister in that capacity, I went to funerals, I went to hospitals, I went to weddings, I went to births. I was just there all the time in a cycle of life. In a way that I think a lot of suburban American existence separates us from. And the other thing that happened in my own life is that my childhood home in Southern California, if you walked out my front door, I was in this super built environment, terraced, landscaped, developed subdivision, but the backyard was uncultivated foothills, and there was a different kind of danger depending on and excitement depending on which direction you walked in. So here's a newer poem also thinking about circularity a different way. This beginning may have always meant this end. coming from a place where we meandered mornings and met quail, scrub jay, mockingbird. I knew coyote. Like everyone else, I knew cactus, knew tumbleweed, lichen on the rocks and pill bugs beneath. Rattlers sometimes, the soft smell of sage and the ferment of cactus pear, coming from this place, from a place where grass might grow greener on the hillside in winter than in any yard, where the whole rest of the year, everything I loved, chaparral pea, bottlebrush tree, jacaranda, mariposa, pinyon, and desert oak, the kumquat in the back garden and wisteria vining the porch, the dry grass whispering long after the last rains, raccoons in and out of the hills, trash hurled by the hottest wind, the dry grass tall now and golden, lawn chairs, eucalyptus, everything in a place we knew. Everything we knew, little and large and mine and ours, except horror, all of it, everything could flame up that quickly, could flare and be gone. I think that this sense of constant precarity, that a certain kinds of ways of living and certain people's living in the world brings up regularly is kind of always in my work. And yet that precarity, I feel like, must always be coupled with beauty and resistance and possibility and connection. And so I feel like maybe I will close with the final poem, which is actually the first poem of my first book. And then Chris and I can talk about all the things. I feel like my daughter wants to say something to me.
So since the word is closed, Grandma can't get in. So I'm going to have to walk out a little bit. So that's
okay. Be safe.
I
love you. Okay. That's what happens in real life. Her grandmother's taking her to dance, but the road is closed for road construction. What happens? Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice rising so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky and the coyote's yip knocks it shut. The way the aspen's bells conform to the breeze, while the rapid's drum defines resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, pinyon with another. Rock, wind her hand, water her brush, spells and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather, the bank we map our lives around.
It was beautiful. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
I wonder, just seeing your daughter there, and I just read your book about a lot of poems about your daughter and how your life has changed. I wonder, I have a question. You have this recurring trope in your book of being asked questions that you always get asked, frequently asked questions. And one of them is how your writing has changed, your writing practices have changed. I don't want to ask that. I want to ask, how has your poetry changed over time? And how has your relation to poetry changed over time? And by that, I mean your expectations of it and where it fits into your life. And that may be one question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one of my expectations that has changed is porosity, like a willingness to allow my poems to be porous, to like let my daughter come in the middle of a thing and not be like, no, this isn't important, like that happens in actual life. And in fact, this is an important is I'm living a life in community with other people. That's the most important thing, always. Or even I'm living a life in community with other living beings. That sort of largeness. I just found when I pulled this book out, because Chris had asked me to read a poem from this book, and I found a note that I had in this about Robertson Jeffers, who is a poet who influenced me. That could be a whole day. We could talk about that. But this note I've written is, Jeffers believed that, quote, humans fail to recognize the significance of other creatures and things in the universe. Right? And I think that is very, very frequently true, maybe not unilaterally for humans, but it is certainly true in the Western tradition. And actually really partially because of the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition of like this kind of grant of dominion, right? That grant of dominion means an inability to see lives that are different from us as cohabitants and partners, but as opposed to lives that we are in charge of and responsible for or masters of, et cetera. As a Black woman, that gets super complicated several steps up the ladder, right? In lots of different ways. And so I think that the amount, like studying more history, living more in the world, living more like really in the world, has allowed my poems to admit the messiness of what it means to be a modern human, and where my culpabilities are, and where my action and work can be.
Maybe I can get you to read one poem that you didn't read called Ars Poetica After the Dam.
Sure.
Have your book there? Because
yeah, I can grab it. Yeah, this one's tricky, because I feel like if you were to teach this poem in a class, one really reasonable question the students might ask is, wait, but where are we in time? What happens at the end? And so I'll read the poem, and then we can talk about why I was okay releasing the poem into the world, where I know that that's going to be a question. Ars Poetica After the Dam. The floodplains bloom, the horsetail dies, the wheat with its combined eyes eyeing a fat future nods and nods, never fearing. The peasants plant potatoes, plant turnips, radish, and carrot. Even the mice leave the hovels and make camp in the fields. When an inland bird calls from the roof thatch, the boatwright turns from bowsprits and trains his son to cobble. Only that bright-chested bird knows the end of this song, but she is winging over water and must not waste her breath to sing.
Well, I think that's just beautiful. I think that the sound of that is one of the things I read this to my class today. I had a class before we came on here. The floodplains bloom, the horsetail dies, the wheat with its combined eyes eyeing a fat future nods and nods, never fearing. That's Hopkins. That's really wonderful, those sounds. But this is also what I meant by those things being raveled together. I mean, this has trophic cascade in it, I guess, or at least it has kind of environmental change causing humans to change. And it also has the life of nature becoming your life, where only the bright-chested bird knows the end of this song, which is a beautiful way of putting it. And So I guess my question is that, I mean, I don't find it that difficult, but maybe you can help with that difficulty of the middle part, and then we can talk about one other thing about this I want to talk about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like, so is it after the dam, like after the dam is put in place, or after the dam is no longer in place, right? Like, because there's this inland bird who's singing, who like tells everybody that the flooding's done, but now the inland bird is winging over water, and so is it flooding again, right? I think that all of those stories, like, we're always both in Eden and after Eden. We're always like in the middle of the behavior that caused the flood and after the redemption of the flood. Like, I feel like we're always in both those places. And so that's part of how we never know how the song's going to end, because we don't know where we're in many places at once.
Yeah.
Always.
Did you ever come across, when you were doing that anthology Black Nature? I forgot to mention that in the introduction, but Camille did a wonderful anthology called Black Nature of African American nature poetry. Did you ever come across a writer named David Abram? He's not Black, but he wrote a book called The Spell of the Sensuous.
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think so.
I think you'd love but the reason that this poem makes me think of it so much is because he talks about how language, our sense of language and our sense of reality have atrophied as we've grown further from the natural world, because it's not just we who have a reciprocal relationship with nature, it's actually language itself has a reciprocal relationship. And so the silence of the natural world and speech of the natural world is actually part of language, or language becomes inert and mechanized and dangerous. That's what this poem says so beautifully. And I was wondering maybe you can talk a little bit about that anthology and why you did it and what it enabled you to do in your own work.
Sure. Yeah. I think that like the title Ars Poetica, it's essentially a poem, the art of poetry. And so it's a poem, and Ars Poetica is a poem in which a poet declares, this is what poetry it is and means to me. And Terrific Cascade has a series of Ars Poetica where I'm sort of reaching towards what it might mean to be a writer, but they're all sort of like, they're called Ars Poetica, and that's why you know, but besides that, they kind of are like a little bit at a remove from what you might expect the treatise on the art of poetry might entail. And I think in this case, it's like one thing about understanding the art of poetry for me is understanding that we're always in the middle of like not knowing how the story is going to end, because we don't actually know where we are in the story when we're in the midst of it, when we're in the midst of our lives. And also that like this attention, like really, I must pay attention to the world around me, that my survival on so many levels, you know, our ecological survival, my kind of like spiritual, personal survival, just my like ability to breathe, again, both like fundamentally and technically, without pollution, but also just like the peace that you have when you like touch soil. All of those things require my sensorial connection to the world that's larger than mine, and bringing that into my practice, into my profession, into my vocations, all of those kinds of things. So Black Nature started, I read one of the poems I read to you today, Language, and a couple other environmentally influenced poems at a major writers conference called AWP. And I read these poems, and somebody came up to me and said, I've never really thought about Black people writing about the natural world before this reading. And do you know any other writers who do that? And it became a question that has like stayed with me all of this time, because the answer is I did. I knew plenty of writers who I love and revere. And in my own, at the time, my own little collection of, typed poems that I have in my file in my computer of poems that I just want to figure out how they work. And so I type them in myself to my computer. I had, like, at that time, maybe 50 poems that we could really easily call environmental or nature poems. But I had to do a literature review to convince the press that this was a necessary book. And in all of the environmental nature poetry writing anthologies of the time, we're in 2006 now, all of the major anthologies and many of the major journals I found, and I feel like I need to say, because I'm speaking at, to Yale, and so you understand what like a really quality university library means. I was at Stanford and Berkeley's libraries doing this research, so it wasn't like I was just like at some like podunk like local public library. I was at like two of the best collections in the world available to me. I found 6 poems by 5 Black writers, and that's it. It wasn't that we weren't doing the work. I was very, very quickly able to create an anthology that collected nearly 200 poets. It was that we weren't being seen because of the ways that writers were being categorized. And so if Black writers were writing about the natural world, they were also often writing about history or about some sort of social construct or about being a mother. And so they would be mother poems or history poems or protest poems. They wouldn't be categorized as nature writing. And then so even the writers who like were very clearly just like straight up nature writers, it was always like, so this is a metaphor for what it means to be a Black woman in America, right? Like and it was only symbolic, it was only metaphorical, as opposed to, yes, and there was a fox that just hung out at my house all the time for a summer, and I wrote about her, right? Like that is also true. It's a Lucille Clifton series that's just amazing. That is also true. And you can understand the fox to be symbolic and representative and metaphorical, but there's a fox, there's an actual fox. And so what happens very frequently for writers who are systemically marginalized is the parts of our lives that that can be sort of captured to talk about identity are only used to talk about identity, and the sort of connection and comparison disappears. And so for me, one of the most important things about Black nature was this intervention to be able to bring these writers forward, but also I guess like a charge and a permission to myself that I got to write about whatever I wanted to write about in whatever way I wanted to write about it. And I got to own my story in the way that I wanted to own it, and not feel beholden to some external idea about what I could or should be writing about as a Black woman. But an internal push to write about what I needed to write about as Camille.
Do you think that situation has changed in the way that Black writers have, or in their relation to nature, or the way that they're perceived?
I'm gonna say positive. I think we like this, like we got a long history, and so we got a lot of work to do with all things, but I do think that in Laura Gray Street and Ann Fisher Worth published their eco-poetry anthology in 2013. That book was significantly more inclusive of people of color, of women, of all kinds of folk. Joshua Corey and G.C. Waldrop published another collection. Like Melissa Tucker has her Ghost Fishing Eco Justice anthology, which is like broadly more inclusive. That was published, I think, in 2016. And so that's right there. I could name just 3. Copper Canyon has an anthology. Like, I think that the doors have opened. And one of the reasons that the doors have opened more is just that the understanding of the urgency to speak saliently and with diverse perspectives about environmental catastrophe and also kind of cultural catastrophe is just more at the forefront of so many people's minds. And so the idea of limiting writing about nature to only being like this kind of sublime, untouched space that wasn't even the space John Muir was writing in, but it's the space that like we try to imagine John Muir was writing in, like forgetting the fact that his whole point was the degradation of the Sierras and how we needed to, right? Like we need to get back to this pristine kind of thing. All right, I'm spitting out. This is my thing now as we're talking, but I do think that what has happened is there are more seats at the table for more kinds of people. And so that is exciting.
Well, we have a question that is a good segue, links a couple of things you've mentioned. Is faith a present reality in your life and work now, or a tradition experience you draw upon from your past? If yes, how? Especially given your fierce concern for environmental damage. So the question is, how does faith link up with, well, how does it exist for you now? And how does it link up with your concern for the environment?
Yeah. So I used to defensively, my parents are still like every Sunday church people and like on the governance boards for churches and things like that. And I used to kind of defend the ways that I choose to spend my Sundays as saying like, I like to spend it in the church of God and the great outdoors sometimes, which is still true. Like I like a good Sunday morning paddle boarding, and I feel like that is being directly in contact with the creator and the creation in really important ways. And I've got all kinds of really complicated experiences that I've personally had with the church that is like the people that make the church in the last 5 years or so, like triggered around the Trump election and moving from there. And so, and that also shows up in my writing. Like, what does it mean for different people to show up as they are? And the ways that we show up as we are not always, do not always hold other people's lives and hearts with care. And so those questions of the people part of church and faith also show up in my work.
So it sounds like you find them some sort of antagonistic relationship between religion and the environment. That's what the question's trying to say.
Yeah, and like religion and faith, or religion and spirituality. Yes, I do. I find conflict, and also just like, and science. Like there's a number of different things that have me always having lots of questions. That being said, I am raising my daughter like in the traditions because I do, there's a lot about it that I value. And so how do we kind of play all those contradictions? But I think that that's more interesting than just being like, yes, lockstep, right, and I just swallow it. So I think like I'm no longer squeamish about the fact that I live in uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was really interested in having people hear you read one very brief section from this book, so that on page 33, which I think is also another really good example of how you weave these various things together. Maybe you can introduce that and read that part.
Sure. Yeah, you guys are going to get the very end of a sort of 25-page essay where my daughter is 6 months old when the situation here happens. She had that day, that morning, decided she was just learning how to sit up, and she decided to grab her cribmobile when it was in motion and like flung herself around on the cribmobile and like fell, like almost hit like her anterior fontanelles on the slashes. Like, you know, I'm like a new mother. It was like the most terrifying thing ever. And so she's bawling and I'm bawling, and I put her in the stroller and we take a walk. I was living in Oakland, California at the time, and we took a walk straight up this hill to the Mormon temple that sits on the top of this really steep hill. And there I ran into the story about the first big Anglo settlement of in the area we now call San Francisco, and it was a ship full of Mormon settlers who come all the way around the Cape. It was not a safe journey. Lots of people, particularly children, lost their lives. And I was just like, what drives a person to take such a risk to start a new life, right? You cry again, obviously rooting. I love that word, rooting, as if by seeking your mother's milk, you are planting yourself in this world. I take you out of the stroller and bring you to a bench where I can hold you, where I look across the houses of Oakland and out into the bay. I nurse you while I steady my gaze on Yerba Buena Island, known in a decimated people's decimated language as Seabird Island. The island was later known as Wood Island because of sunken ships and lost treasure. Arbor Day plantings of 19th century Arbor Day plantings of the 19th century installed invasive species that have mostly squeezed out the native plant the Spanish once called Yerba Buena. I don't know what I know now that I can name these losses. I soothe your cries and look out over the bay toward where, somewhere in 1846, Georgiana Pacific Robbins must have cried for much the same reason and in much the same way. As she nursed her, did her mother call her darling, sweet pea, little honeybee, Georgiana Pacific? When she looked out at the ocean where she lost those other children, what was there to say? I don't know if there is a name for this in any language, this hope and hurt and hunger I hold when I hold you. The story of the Brooklyn makes me breathless with sadness and a relief that borders on joy. I haven't lost you yet, I think. I haven't lost you yet. I haven't lost you yet. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God.
And that yet is very excruciating in that. I mean, it's a beautiful passage, but the yet is particularly painful. And there's a moment, this book ends with a terrifying moment as well. And I wonder if you could just describe that, because I found it so disturbing, because our kids are the same age. And also just about being in Ghana and all the extended time you've spent there, and what's that meant to you as a person and you as a poet.
Such a great question. Yeah, the final essay, this is a travel log in my I was a crazy person. When I was pregnant and in the first of 3 years of my daughter's life, I was touring with these books, and I was I was everywhere, and Callie came with me. It was just the easiest thing, as she was still nursing. And so she and I traveled all over the world, all over the country together. And so a lot of the book is about the kind of ways that I learned to see myself and the world differently, because I had this child with me. People treat you differently when you have a child, often better when it's a little cute baby. So we went to Ghana, and on which is on the west coast of Africa, a part of the continent which was called the Slave Coast, or the Gold Coast, or the Ivory Coast. It was about what could be extracted, and humans were one thing that was extracted. And all along the coast in Ghana are these what are called slave castles or slave forts, where collections of enslaved people would have been gathered to be sent over the oceans. And we went to a number of them. Callie was almost 3. Crazy things happened, including Callie having a super prescient conversation with a priest of the Ifa tradition, like an ancient West African tradition, where Callie acknowledged the priest using the sacred number of bows and acknowledgements in that tradition, which I had not taught her. She just did it. And the priest was like, well done, young lady, and like acknowledged her in this way that was really something to see. And then after that, we're like, we've had enough. Let's just go to the beach and just chill, which that beach is super treacherous, and there's sneaker waves come a lot. And so we were hanging out, having a nice time, and she was on my husband's back, and a wave just came out of nowhere, and she wasn't on his back anymore. And we had to kind of find her in the water. And that I haven't lost you yet thing, again, like how many parents lost their children to those waters, and why was I spared that time? You know, was it because of her connection with that priest in that space? Was it just luck? Was it like there's no way to, there's like somebody might know, but like there's no way for me to know. And that to me is part of what faith is. Part of what faith for me is sort of like trusting, like it hasn't all fallen apart yet. Whatever this is that is holding me and holding those I love up will continue to do that for a while longer. And I have to trust that. I just have to trust that. And there are things that can be done. There's ways that I can make decisions I make, ways that I can actively work to honor, right? As like, I really think it's important that my daughter did what she did in that space. And to like be a steward and care for the world, but also just don't know what the next minute is going to bring. Yeah. And so can I make each moment matter, right? While I'm here.
So that's a way of thinking of time, and these increments are being fully present in this moment. But you there's also such a, I mean, what part of what's so poignant about that is what you articulated is the sense of deep past and the horror of it. And you have such a sense of place. And I wonder if you're conscious of that and how it exists for you now, and like what defines home for you, or a place, or, you know, sometimes you write about being haunted by these places. Like in Lynchburg, I was very struck by where you wrote about going to the bonfire, which had to be at Scott's house.
Yeah, I was at Scott's house.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure I was at that bonfire. And you didn't, I can't remember if you turned away or something because of your memories, or you had a physical sense of the horrors latent in the geography of the place. Right.
Yeah. And that happens to me a lot. As you may have gathered, because Chris and I were in Lynchburg, we were teaching at 2 local colleges at the same time. And it's a particular kind of town. And so you find your people in order to kind of hold you up. And we writers stuck together there. But that's a place with like a kind of circularity too, like maybe that's part of my circularity. So as it happens, Lynchburg is the town where my grandfather had his first church. It's the town where my mother was born. And then it was where my professional career was born, because it's where I had my first tenure track teaching job. And so like 3 generations began their life in this town, and always really short. You know, we'd be there for 7 years or 8 years, and then we'd leave, and then some new thing would happen. The place I call home is the American West. So I was actually born in Colorado, and that's important because Coloradans have justifiable opinions about Californians. I spent most of my life in California, but was born in Colorado. This landscape, this dryness that I talked about in that one poem, the propensity for fire, the living with not very much rain, and what that means, a golden brown hill being a beautiful thing, not like a dry scratchy thing, like all those things feel, the sky, the lack of humidity, all those things feel right to me. And so when I lived on the East Coast for just over a decade, I was always really imagining myself back to the West. And yet my family roots are in Louisiana, Arkansas, Virginia, right? Like, so when I'm in the East, there are other ways that I am connected there. And then I have family roots across continents, right? I have, like obviously the African diaspora. And so when I go back there, what are the ways that those connections, like I hear like in Twi, which is one of the languages in West Africa, like I hear there's intonations and there's like ways of phrasing that feel very familiar. Even I don't know the language, but there's a way of understanding how the language is spoken that I do understand. And so being open, traveling as much as I have and moving around as much as I have, I'm able to see like where, if I get to choose where I plant myself, where I would like to choose, but also the ways in which other places have can also be home, can also have connection for me in the short and long history.
Is it mostly that sense of place? I mean, I've just mentioned 2 hauntings, the one in Lynchburg and the one in Ghana. What is it when it's the opposite? Is that what roots?
Yeah, I mean, so the Lynchburg story, Chris is referencing an essay in Guidebook to Relative Strangers where I talk first about going to these bonfires. Like people in the South like love themselves a bonfire. They just love like throwing some wood on a fire and like maybe some meat and definitely beer and like dancing around a fire. And like I never liked them. I always found them really anxious making, and I thought it was this kind of Black history connection, because those really are connected with the history of lynching in America. And so that's what I thought was really going on. And then I went to a very different region and was at a bonfire, and like all of that historical connection was gone, and I was still freaked out. And I was like, oh yeah, like how many times did I see the hills behind my house catch fire because like a cigarette or a spark from a car, like that campfire, like which was in 2018, I guess the largest fire in the history of California. It was backfire from a tail, like those kinds of little things will just create such havoc. And I realized that also it's not in opposition, it's that I am also worried about natural fires and wildfires. And so both of those things together, this like historic resonance that I put on it, and this like bringing California to haunt Maine, right? Like it wasn't Maine's fault there. It's very wet in Maine. It is not going to catch fire. Like that was not what the problem was, but I brought my Californian history to haunt that space too. So I think that sort of back and forth is, I guess, part of how I'm always thinking.
No, that's great. I think you've answered this question. Well, maybe this is a good place. Does being at home in a particular landscape, such as the American West, shape your inner landscape or spiritual disposition in a particular way?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think that with the American West, just we just have more space. We have more more ability to very quickly get out into nature and into like this sublime sense of the beautiful. And so I like get charged by those landscapes differently than when I'm in New York City, for instance. And I also think that because of that, the West has a kind of democratization of access to the greater than human world that other parts of this country don't have. Like if you live in New York City, you have to pay a fair amount of money to have access to space and a beautiful view. If you live in California, if you live in San Francisco, you just have to climb a hill somewhere. And then you have space and there's a view, right? And so there's just different kind of access to a sense that the world is larger than the human. And so then that shapes all of my ideas then about the great chain of being and how my faith will or sense of powers beyond me manifest.
There's a great quote from Larry McMurtry where he says, I'm not endorsing this, but it's funny. He says that if you've ever truly experienced the nature in the American West and the sort of geographic consciousness of the American West, and the East Coast is insipid. East Coast nature is insipid. That's what he said, not me. Not me.
I mean, there's some beauty. You have your own kinds of beauty.
Yeah,
but,
no, I love the East Coast. That was terrific, Camille. Thank you so much. I think we've come to a place to stop, but it's great to hear your poems. The new work is terrific and great to reconnect after all these years. I know Zoom readings are weird and we just have to sign off, but thank you.
Thanks so much. It was great to share some of Terrific Cascade and Guidebook to Relative Strangers with you all, and this like whole conversation was fantastic. So thanks for taking an hour of your afternoons to speak with me.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.